everyone. This is Andrew Lennon. I'm going to talk to you about God. Um, I'm going to talk to you about it in a way that's a lot different than you're used to. You're probably used to hearing things about magic and about, well, things are this way just because God said so. I'm going to talk to you more from a physicist perspective, a real God that, you know, obviously we can't understand a lot of things, and so magic is a term that we like to use when we don't understand things, but we're going to try and back away from that a little bit. Obviously, I'm not going to advocate against faith. There's a lot of things I don't understand in physics, and to a degree, I have to have faith. But this isn't going to be the kind of faith where you simply believe things without evidence. So let's get into it. Let's start talking about God. All right, so the very first question usually people raise when it comes to God is, does God exist? So first, when talking about God, we have to go to the root of the question, which is, who is God? Okay. Now, I guess there's a couple ways to look at it. One is the author of all morality, all goodness, the person who says what's right and what's wrong. And the second part of it is to get to specifically, who is he? Where is he? What's he up to? So let's address the first part. Every time that you say this is good and this is bad, the question must be asked, why? Or, more pointedly, by what authority? In other words, who says so? Like, for instance, if I said slavery is bad, now many people may agree with that, but by what authority is it bad? Which is to say, why can't somebody just say it's good? Okay, and many people have, as we're well aware. This authority to say what's good and bad doesn't necessarily come from magic, and it doesn't necessarily come from waving a wand, right, and saying, well, God said it or whatever. The authority comes from knowledge. It comes from understanding. Okay, so for instance, and really saying something is good or bad is an assessment of value. Something is more valuable than another thing. Something is negative value, it's evil, right? It makes things worse. So who is to say that something makes things better or has value? And the thing that says it, well, when we don't understand what gives things value, then we have to go on faith. And the faith is placed in someone who we believe has the authority or the power to say that thing is good or bad. When it comes to values, it isn't just that I point a gun to you and I say, all right, you will believe that slavery is bad. Otherwise, I pull the trigger. Obviously, there's a little bit of authority there because I have the power to end your life by pulling the trigger. But the authority it's not necessarily on a values level. It's more on a physical level. Okay, so the values level is kind of spiritual. And the physical level is when I threaten you. Okay, so I can threaten someone all day long and they'll never believe what I say, right? Or I can threaten them and they'll believe instantly. At least they'll think they'll believe. But it's not the threat or the physical part that made them believe. We're operating in really two different realms. Okay, it's the spiritual aspect that we're talking about when we talk about morality. And so, in the first case that I just mentioned, if you say slavery is bad, you are saying that you're making a moral assertion, that you have the authority to declare a value like that. Now, you may have good reasons to believe that. There may be a few studies and empirical evidence to say societies are better or worse by following one thing or another. Okay, and there's some authority with studies, but there's no omniscience from those studies, which is to say there's no absolute perfect knowledge. Okay, what that means is that someone could come on later and say, here's another study shows something a little different. And it might make you question whether the first study and the first authority was good, whether the assessment was good or not. So ultimately, it's only the most knowledgeable authority or most knowledgeable source that can say what is good or bad. Otherwise, you're listening to fools. And we do that a lot. We listen to ourselves even. We are one of our biggest fools because we are not omniscient. There's a lot of stuff we don't know. There's a lot of things that we'll say is right or good, and then later we'll change our minds. And hopefully, we won't be stubborn. Hopefully, we will change our minds and we'll learn new things and become better. And so this gradual process of learning new things, hopefully brings us to a better morality, but it doesn't guarantee that. So we can learn new things and change our view, think that we're in a better position, but actually adopt something that's morally egregious. Okay, we can learn things about the history of the Jews, which might slant our opinions of the Jewish race or the Jewish nation. And that might lead us to take on anti-Jewish feelings, anti-Semitism. Might even cause us to start a Holocaust, like in Germany. Okay, they did that. And why? Because they learned some things. They thought they had progressed. It's a very dangerous word there, progression or progressive, because it's not always progression. It's dangerous because we convince ourselves that we're in a better place, that we know more. And oftentimes we do that to our own foolishness, to our own destruction. So, all right. We talked about omniscience. Men are not omniscient. Men are not omnipotent. There's a finite limit to what I can do. And why not? Because I'm limited. My body is mortal. It'll die. It gets diseases. It's weak. I consume my strength over time. I get tired. Okay. My brain can't remember everything. I can't be omniscient. Even if I spent an eternity learning, my brain just can't contain it all. I'm mortal. And so no mortal person can have either omniscience or omnipotence. And so no mortal person should be able to say, this is right or this is wrong. Now let me jump back there. No mortal person should be able to say on their own authority that something is right or something is wrong, because our authority, what good is it? You find the wisest people in the world and you might awe and ooh about their wisdom, and they might have some good wisdom, but they're not omniscient and they don't have perfect wisdom. And so some of their wisdom can be flawed. And that's actually the worst part, because if we place our trust in those with imperfect wisdom, the more perfect we think their wisdom is, the more trust and confidence we put into it, the more faith we put into it. The worse it is, because for those things that they're wrong, we are less likely to consider that they're wrong. Okay. So I hope you notice I've been putting together this idea about who is the authority between man and God. Okay, we haven't got to yet who God is yet, but I hope it's becoming clear that we actually make ourselves to be gods. We say this is right and this is wrong by my authority. Okay, we don't usually say whose authority, we just say it's right or wrong. But implicit in that is by some authority. Okay. Now, so that's where I take great care to make sure that I don't assert myself as God. That's the one thing I know. I am not God. Okay. I know there is a God. I know that I'm not him. I can say both of those things. But that second part means that I can't say the Holocaust was bad by my authority. What I do say is the Holocaust was bad by God's authority. Now, a lot of people should have red flags on that part, because to invoke the authority of God assumes an understanding of God. And what mortal man can understand God? He's omniscient after all. We aren't. How can we know what he knows and understand what he understands? Well, it's not as hard as it turns out. Okay. Actually, it is and it isn't. So when God speaks, unfortunately, we hear him from our own understanding, which means we misunderstand him. When he speaks by the Spirit, as we say, he doesn't speak with the human tongue, so he bypasses a lot of the problems with language, which limit our ability to understand. But we're still not omniscient. We still lack the frame of reference, and so when he speaks, God can't give us a full understanding. So those who speak on the authority of God still have to be quite careful, because they might misunderstand him. And so oftentimes what we'll do is we'll take the things that God has said and we'll compare them between different people. Okay, so if 3 people say 3 different things that God has said, and we believe that they heard God, right, that God spoke those things to them, and we try to put them together to find out what's the common theme, or what's the common message. And in that commonality is where we start to understand God's word better. But even still, in the commonality, there are flaws that we all have together. A common heritage, as you might call it, or a common tradition. And these heritage and traditions form the way we think. They shape the way we all think in common. And so they tend to give us problems with understanding God. Now, you might notice I'm still talking about the communication from God as a thing that's certain in effect, which I know it is. And I'll get to that part later. I will get to it about does God exist, right? But at the very least, I'd like you to understand 2 things, 2 frames of reference. One is that anything that we say as a moral right and wrong is from the position of some authority that said it. The UN said something, and they must be right because they're the UN, right? Or some president of our country said something, and they must be right because they're the president. And it always comes back to the idea of what makes the UN omniscient, what makes them qualified to say anything. Well, they're very old and wise people, or which they aren't, right? Maybe I say that about the courts. They're very experienced in matters of justice and matters of human law. Well, who says that human law is good? Who says that human law is perfect? Who creates human law but humans? We're all imperfect and sinful. We love to hurt each other. We love to entertain our own foolishness. All right. So I think that's good enough talking about moral authority. Everyone has moral authority. Even atheists, they all turn to some kind of moral authority. I mean, how can they live life without a system of values? One thing is more important than another. One thing is right and another thing is wrong. So they might claim that it's just common knowledge, but where does that common knowledge come from? It's always a good question. Is it historical or contextual? Historical context or cultural context? Is it something that God taught? It all comes from somewhere. Okay, so even the non-religious are religious. They just don't recognize which God they serve. They don't acknowledge where their moral authority comes from. All right, so let's talk about, does God exist? Okay. This part, I think, is actually relatively simple because we have a lot of witnesses of God. Okay. Just because you don't see the tree in the Amazon doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But if you found 10 people, good witnesses, that have seen that tree, you can be pretty certain it exists. And I can tell you that we have a lot of witnesses of God. Now, some people want to push back and say, well, what about the witnesses of Krishna, witnesses of Allah, And that all assumes that those are different beings. Okay, that all assumes they're not the same. Okay. Now, they might say, well, different things are understood or taught by these, we'll say, allegedly different gods. And that is true, but that doesn't mean that the teachings came from God. There are a lot of things that we say about God that aren't true. People teach all kinds of things that they want others to believe. So, what makes you think that a person really did hear the voice of God? Well, here comes the other part. It's oftentimes criticized about religion. Well, they all say the same things. They all teach general goodness. Interesting. Now, we see a common line, and in what you discredit God or discredit religion because they're all the same. That's actually a good evidence that there's something there. Okay. The difference is, well, yeah, people have developed different cultures, different understandings, different perspectives. So of course they're going to have different understandings if they come from different worldviews. God's not going to be able to teach everybody the same things. Different cultures aren't ready for his full law. We remember in the Old Testament that, well, there was a lot of pretty harsh things with stonings and pretty harsh laws. Is what the people, the old times were ready for. And they weren't ready for a higher, better, newer law. They weren't ready to think that like that. So, yeah, God's going to operate differently because he can only really talk to us in the ways that we're willing to hear. So, I hope that makes sense, that people will only hear the things they're ready to hear. So they won't get God's full law, they won't get the full truth, and they'll make up stuff. They will. And how do they know whether what they are understanding is something they made up or something that God told them? I'd like to talk about that in a different video, but that gets intense. That gets really, really deep. But there are some simple things that we can turn to from that. In the first place, we can turn to the people who we know have talked with God. In the less simple cases, we can exclude the people who we're not sure talked with God by seeing their teachings being obviously evil. Okay. If a certain religious leader advocates to destroy half the earth for their religious beliefs, is he, God's, servant? Well, maybe not. Probably not. Okay. So, yeah, it's one of those things, it's a little hard to tell, but sometimes they give it away by teaching things that are blatantly false, and then they end up changing their story and saying that they were, that they had a false angel or a black angel reveal things when they thought he was a white angel, he was a good one. So, that I'm speaking of a major world religion there. So anyhow, yeah, it's a little more tricky. So it's really helpful just to go back to, well, what's the foundation? And the foundation is what God has taught in the earliest religions, and looking to, do they seem to be universal truths, or do they seem to be the foolishness of man? Yeah, part of me wants to get into it, just to go into it, but it's a bit deep. I think the simplest way, I do want to give you a simple way to think about it. So you look at the 10 Commandments. What do you see? And there's a lot of good stuff. I'm going to skip past the things that are a little harder, like worshiping God, right? It can be a little hard to understand why that is a universal truth, but thou shalt not kill, right? It's a little more complicated than that. Thou shalt not lie, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, okay? Those are pretty obvious. Those are pretty core or fundamental. And those are kinds of things you can say, all right, here we have some foundations. And this is why atheists can't just go through and do a Google search on a few scriptures and think he's an expert on the Bible and he knows everything that's wrong with it or everything that's wrong with God. Okay. You really do need to dedicate a lot of time, prayer, and meditation to be able to sort these things out as you read the Bible, read the scriptures. All right, so does God exist? Back to that primary question. So I've talked a lot about misunderstandings God. Talked a lot about different forms that people see God in. Okay. Obviously, God does have a correct and true form. We can't see him. Well, some of us have, but most of us can't. We're all mortal, limited. But the forms that he does exist, or form that he exists in, the truth that he has, that is, while it's beyond our comprehension, it also makes a lot of sense. Okay. Is God everywhere and nowhere? Is he magical? No, he's not. He's not magical. And thus magic is simply you don't understand how God works. Okay? A magician will do a trick and people will not understand how his magic worked. So they'll call it magic. It wasn't magic, it was all real. You were just maybe you might say you were deceived, and magicians, I don't like that they intentionally deceive you to create their magic. But a better way to look at it is you didn't understand. Okay? And deception is really a lack of understanding. So you didn't understand the magician, so you call it magic. You didn't understand God, so you call it magic. Okay? No, God is not everywhere and nowhere, everything and nothing. God is real. He has a real body, just like us. He calls himself our Father, calls us his children, and he means that literally. We are literally his children. God is. So then, how can it be? Right? Where is he? Well, in the first place, we may be seeing him without realizing it. Okay. And interestingly enough, nobody makes the connection between UFOs and God. I always find it funny when I say, "Hey, do you believe in God?" They say, "No." "Do you believe in UFOs?" They're like, "I don't know, maybe." Why is it that you can be so different on that question? What if God has his angels flying UFOs, right? Advanced technology. I mean, it's certainly in his purview to have omniscience, all science, advanced technology. Why not? And I find it funny how it boggles people's minds because they're so used to thinking about God in the magical realm. And now it's like, wait a minute, he could actually be real? I mean, it blows people's minds. Okay, now I'm not saying absolutely that UFOs exist, though. I've seen a lot of really strong evidence. Really, really strong. I'm pretty certain about it. I'm not saying that God has his angels flying UFOs, right? That he flies spacecraft. But it makes sense. It makes a whole lot of sense. And in the first place, if God's omniscient, if God has advanced technology that can make you think the things he does is magic, why not use technology? We have plenty of very popular TV shows like Stargate and Star Trek, where they clearly show primitive people see their advanced technology and go, wow, right? That's magic. So why not? And until you can say why not, you really have to say if you think even UFOs are possible, you have to say God is possible. If you think UFOs are likely, you have to say God is likely. Not just because he might be, and I wouldn't call him an alien, right? Because he's human. He's our Father. But really, human or not, it really doesn't matter. He exists. And aliens exist. And UFOs exist, right? So until you can prove all those things now, so a lot of atheists will say, well, since we don't have any evidence of God, we must assume he doesn't exist. In the first place, you don't have to assume anything. You don't have to assume someone doesn't exist merely because you don't have evidence. And that you do have evidence, you certainly should not be foolish enough to wave it away and say, well, these testimonies, I'm going to wave them away because I don't like them. Okay? I'm going to wave them away because I don't have a picture. I don't have the kind of evidence that I want. Okay? You can't do that. In the first place, God's omnipotent and omniscient. What person in the right mind would demand, they would say, the President of the United States does not exist unless he does X, Y, Z. I mean, with the arrogance of it. And even more arrogance to say that of the creator of the universe. Unless he does X, Y, Z. Right? He exists regardless. He really doesn't care if you don't believe him. That's your choice. But how much sleep is the President of the United States going to lose because you don't believe he exists? Right? Same thing with the creator of the universe. So, does God have to give you the evidence that you want? No. But when you do receive evidence, like testimony, like visions, like revelation, which we, all of those who engaged on a serious spiritual journey have received. Okay, myself included. Many people have seen God. Okay, same here. So with all that evidence, to discount God simply because maybe you don't have, I'm just trying to think of some evidence, random evidence. You don't have a beaker test result that you wanted to see, right? Some scientific experiment that went your way, right? In the first place, you're looking in the wrong places. Do you have evidence of UFOs? Certainly do. I'm not saying all of it is legitimate. There's no doubt that some people have manufactured UFO evidence, created things that obviously weren't real to kind of publicity or whatever they want to, get likes or, anything like that. But there's no doubt that most of the evidence that I've seen is real. Even stuff that was released by the Pentagon on UFO stuff that's recorded by the military, U.S. military. So we've got the evidence. We can't say it doesn't exist, and we can't say it's not God. Okay, or maybe other creations that God has sent to act on His behalf to come over here. Okay, most likely people. I imagine. I don't know. I can't say how God works. So that leads me to the last thing that I want to talk about with the existence of God, which is our ideas of who God is. So I see a lot of questions about, does God believe this? Will God forgive me for that? And the funny part about these questions is they assume that humans can answer the questions of God. I mean, it is possible. God tells me something. I know the answer because God told me. Okay. It doesn't mean I know all answers or I'm omniscient. I don't know everything that God will say, but I do know the answers to many of the questions. Okay. Because God has answered them. But when I answer them from my knowledge, from my understanding of what God has said. Okay. It's not an absolute omniscient knowledge. And so I might be missing something here or there. I'm not God. I don't have His authority. So in the first case, we really have to stop looking for God in the places we want to see. We have to open our minds up to the idea that God can be operating in ways that we're not expecting, that He can understand things that we don't understand. And we have to stop assuming that some random person on the internet can answer your questions about God. And we have to start going to our own understandings of God. We have to find God ourselves. We have to do the work ourselves. And the problem about that is to get close to God and to communicate with Him, we have to embrace Him. That means we have to embrace His goodness. We have to follow His laws. We have to accept His gospel. We have to change our lives, and we have to dedicate the time. We have to be patient. A lot of people don't want to do that. They don't want to wait. They need to hear now quick, quick, quick. Someone just give me the answer. Okay. But that's not how this life works. That's not how we're intended to progress. We have a much bigger plan. I should say God has a much bigger plan for us and what he expects of us and the potential that he holds for us, okay, because we are his children. He has great things laid in store for us in the future. So I hope I began to answer the question, does God exist? Again, I'm not saying God is an alien or drives a spacecraft, but I am saying that until you rule out absolutely that aliens are not possible and spacecraft are not possible, and that all the evidence that we have of them here on this earth are also not possible, don't exist, unless you can, explain everything that's ever been videotaped to a level that's not just speculatory. Okay, you can't just say, well, it could have been produced like this. It could be explained like that. But I mean to a much harder level of explanation of this is most certainly the way that this particular evidence was obtained or produced. Okay, and no other way could it have been produced that would have made it real or authentic or genuine or possible. Okay, it's a higher level of disproof. So, all right. That's all I want to talk to you about. Does God exist? Future videos, I'm going to go into more about what God thinks, what he said, what we can understand, and hopefully the basis for wisdom and for understanding God's plan, understanding what potential we have, how to get there, practicality. One of the things that I want to focus on in my videos is going to be the why. Okay. I notice a lot of times in the scriptures they don't talk about the why so much. God has his whys. He has his reasons. Okay. And so, and he shares those with us. He will answer our prayers when we are ready to receive them. And so you have to be patient on that. You have to obey his law. You have to have faith. You have to work. But he will answer questions of why. And so a lot of questions even now are coming up like, are there only two genders? Are there only two sexes? Right? What about, very, very small cases where there might be the presence of what might look a little bit like two sexes, right? And why? And what does that mean? And I'd like to talk about those things. So hopefully in a following video, please let me know which topics are more interesting, but we can talk about the why this happens, the what it means, what is gender? Are there a million genders? And we can go to scripture. We can go to Revelation today. We can go to Revelation that God gives us right now, and we can hopefully get good answers to those questions. What if you don't think that you're the gender that you were born as? What does that mean? This LGBT thing is really popping up pretty strongly, at least in American culture, and it's confusing a lot of people, and it's hurting a lot of people. So hopefully we can get some good balance on that and perspective. All right, thanks for watching. Talk to you later.